Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's Octopus Deploy webinar, where we're going to be talking about shaping up Octopus Deploy. Okay, so let's start with some housekeeping. There'll be no need to record anything today. A link of the recording will be emailed to you in the next 48 hours. All questions, please use the Zoom Q&A when you can. If you're on one of our streams on YouTube, Twitch, etc., please, you can put your questions in there, but we would prefer if you put it into the webinar channel on our community Slack as well, but we'll do our best to monitor that for questions. Okay, so let's jump in and actually start today's webinar. Today, we have Bob Walker, the VP of Advisory, Mr. Michael Richardson, the VP of Product at Octopus Deploy, and lastly, but certainly not least, is Mr. Michael Noonan, the VP of Engineering at Octopus Deploy. Hey guys, how are you today?
Yeah, really good. It's a bit
Pretty
late
well,
at
thanks,
night.
Doing great. I'm just waking up.
Yeah.
It's like how many time zones can you get into a single webinar? 3. We definitely need to get a 4th in there somehow.
And the Australians draw the short straw again.
No comment.
Yeah.
So let's jump in then.
Absolutely. So as Derek said, we're going to be talking about how Octopus Deploy implemented Basecamp's Shape Up and some of the problems that it solved, as well as we're going to talk a little bit about the future towards the end as to what we're going to want to improve, what we want to change, and all that other good stuff. But first, let's define the problem. Like, what were we trying to solve? So Mike, I'm going to take you back to when you first joined Octopus Deploy. What was it like? How did we pick up work? How did we work back then?
So Michael and I both joined around about the same time. Michael beat me to it by a little bit. We were working on Octopus 3, which was the conversion over to SQL Server and a whole bunch of fundamental changes. And so that was easy. If you weren't working on getting that shipped, you're probably working on the wrong thing. Shortly after that, it became a case of, well, we got these 10 to 12 really great people who just followed their noses and listened to customer support requests. And, you just started things. We're very good at starting things at that point in time. And there were a few really big things we tried to start and then put down and picked up little things again and did those because they seemed like they were easier pickings. But fast forward a bit, we were struggling to fit all of Octopus in our heads. So we split up into some things we call area teams, where there was groups of 4 people that became experts on parts of Octopus, and they were fairly autonomous. They were extremely autonomous, and figured out, well, look, the customers that sort of really care about our area, we're going to do these things because that really matters to us. And if bugs came in, they'd fix them. If support requests came in, well, they would handle those support requests. So it meant that then those teams, they could be pretty interrupted. If somebody's on holiday and then 3 people are fixing a bug, those projects that they were doing don't move forward. And some of those teams were working on 4 projects at once. And it was just a really interesting time. We'll talk about that a bit more later. But the theme there is that it was easy to start stuff, but it was really tricky to finish stuff or change direction.
Yeah, and so each team was very responsible for kind of setting its own direction. Was anyone thinking about the strategic thinking? Was anyone kind of thinking strategically about the whole product and the direction that we wanted to take it?
Right. Yeah, Octopus is a tool built by software developers for software developers. And that meant, as Mike mentioned, we could have these teams that had a lot of autonomy. And it's probably worth calling out, this definitely wasn't a bad thing. This was a deliberate decision by us to let us ship faster. And so this was good. But at the end of the day, Octopus is one product. And what we found was we could have every team working on what they felt was the highest priority piece of work within their remit. And that still didn't necessarily mean we were working on the highest priority things overall to our customers. And that was a problem. And it wasn't just a lack of central prioritization we were missing. There was also a lack of timing coordination. I don't think anyone could say at any given time when something would ship. And this sort of reached its nadir, I guess, when we had this one week where we shipped these 2 major features that by coincidence came out in the same week. And again, like, this was a conscious decision to decouple these teams to let us move faster. But yeah, shipping 2 things with no marketing coordination, and they could have been one release. This was a time for us to, I guess, take a look at where we were And it felt like we hit a little bit of a fork in the road. We could have doubled down on those independent autonomous teams, but at the time, I don't think we quite had all the disciplines in place to do that. We didn't have enough product managers, designers, QA people. And also our teams probably weren't in quite the right shape either. They weren't aligned with anything customer facing. And so we took a different fork in the road, and that's probably a good segue into what we're about to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to take us just a little bit back to right around early fall of 2019. And we were introduced to Basecamp's Shape Up. Who kind of introduced us to that? How did we find out about Shape Up?
Yeah, a bunch of the software engineers and other people at Octopus have followed the people at 37 Signals, or what became Basecamp. They're good agitators. They have really good language. They like to challenge our industry. And so having followed that, Ryan Singer, one of the primary authors of the book, was kind of publishing bits. And then my team was prodding me saying, hey, there's some really good stuff going on here that might be appropriate. And I literally read the first page of the book once it came out. And it just struck a chord, because the same problems that team were trying to solve at the time just resonated so strongly with us. And even to the point where our founder had said verbatim the same words without having read it before or been led. So that's just where it really struck a chord with us, and then devoured the book from there.
Yeah, what really, aside from that introduction, when you read that kind of that first chapter, what were some of the things that attracted you to Basecamp?
For me, it's a lot to do with the word pictures that the team spent the time to come up with. And what they were doing there, I don't think in writing the book they were trying to sell a methodology. Fair's fair. They're selling Basecamp, they're selling their product and saying, hey, Basecamp's a great way to do this kind of work, and they do it themselves. But as I read it, there was all of this deep thought that had gone into these word pictures. And so in places I'd worked before, we use this idea of Scrum and sprints, and sprint has this mentality to it that it's an anaerobic, unsustainable thing that you do, but yet we would string them together week after week after week. So there's something fundamentally wrong with that word in my experience. Whereas some of the words in Basecamp, in Shape Up, just resonated around what is it, it is nighttime, it's really late, the circuit breaker, the betting table, the fact that we're placing bets, shaping and building. There's just these word pictures that there's another thing called the scope hammer. They really resonate to the point where our team picked these words up, and you can hear them in a day-to-day basis sort of explaining things through these words, and they're very visceral and very real.
Absolutely. So Derek, I have the first page that Mike was talking about of Basecamp's book up on my screen, if you don't mind switching over. And so this was the first, is right up there, like the first 3 bullet points. Team members feel like projects go on, and that's something that we saw. Product managers can't think strategically, which we're talking about just a little bit more. And yes, I think everyone has heard Paul actually ask us this very same question: why can't we get features out the door like we used to in the early days? So, Mike, you talked about a few words like pitches and scope hammer and everything like that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my tab over here, and we're going to actually talk about a pitch that Derek wrote, and we're going to kind of work through this. And so I think it's really, hopefully it's really going to put a concrete example in your mind as to what is a pitch and what are the kinds of discussions that go on with this. So first, let's define the problem. I think that's actually one of the hardest things to do, believe it or not, because you can kind of just think about, oh, I have all these great ideas and I think it'd be great to do this, but yeah, what's really the problem that you want to solve? So what this problem wants to solve is how we do our permission model. So right now our permission model is really based on include only. So for example, let's pretend for a minute that we had all of these different environments in our Octopus Deploy instance. If we wanted to restrict access to production, a person would have to create a team, and they'd have to go in and they'd have to add all of these environments and say, this team has access to deploy to these environments, which worked out okay, assuming we never add another environment and assuming we'd only have to create one team. And that makes things a little bit trickier. And from a maintenance point of view, as you start scaling out and as you start growing. Now, what this document wants to do is it wants to invert that model. And so instead, you'd create a team and disallow deployments to the following environments. So Michael, when you're reading something like this as the product manager, when you see a problem defined like this, what are you looking for in a document?
Well, first of all, Bob, I think this is a really clever way to make sure that this is something that we build by pitching it live in a webinar. So nice tactic. At this stage of the process, I think what I'm looking for is really, is this something valuable and is it something viable? And these sort of focus on the problem and the solution. So with the problem, is it a valuable problem to solve? And we ask ourselves questions like, will customers use it? And we look at that, have people asked for it before? We ourselves are customers of Octopus Deploy, so it's always a good sign if we can empathize with the problem. And this is a pretty good example here, because this is the sort of pitch I can totally empathize with that problem. And I'm reading it thinking, how is it possible that we haven't built this before? So this, I guess, is a good sign. We think about, is it a problem that we should solve? We can't solve every problem in the world. We have to focus on those that we want to solve. Is it timely? We have this concept of timeliness that comes up over and over. Factors tend to converge to make something more, I guess, prioritized at a certain point in time that it would be in another point in time. Thinking about the solution, the proposed solution, this is where we think about, is this something viable? Does it fit inside the existing product? Does it fit with the existing Octopus brand? Do we think we could market it? There's no point building something that we can never tell our customers about. And we also look a little bit into the future as well. And we think, if we built this, how does it help or hinder the other things that are coming up that we know we want to build? So all these factors kind of get swirled together, and yeah.
Yeah. And as you're kind of reading this also, one of the other questions I think comes up quite often is, who can start a document like this? Who can start writing down a problem? Is it restricted really to only people on the product team, or can anyone in the company start writing up a pitch?
No, as we mentioned earlier, Octopus is built by developers for developers. Across the company, I think we have a lot of people that have really strong opinions on the product, and this is great. And when we moved to Shape Up, this is something we were really conscious that we didn't want to discourage. We wanted this to be a really democratic process, that anyone could write these pitches, and they can. As you've seen just now, your team contributes pitches. Your advisory team sits closer to our customers than just about anyone. Our CEO, Paul, writes pitches. Our engineering team definitely does. And of course, the product team does as well. What we found over time is that finishing off the pitch document, well, a lot of people are in a good place to define the problem. Defining the solution is often something different. Not everyone is in the right place to define what the solution should be, because this often involves talking to the engineering teams and subject matter experts. So we kind of landed on this thing where we encourage people to define the problem, and then it often comes to us as the product team to shepherd that pitch through to flesh out the solution, get it onto the betting table, and just shepherd it through the process.
And that was one of the lessons that I learned. It took me a while. I would probably say a good 3, 4, 5 months, because what I would do is I would spend so much time working on the proposed solution and not spending a lot of time defining the problem. I might give a little bit of lip service to the problem, and I just dive right into that solution. And over time, I learned that wasn't the right approach, because although I'm a developer and I've been a developer for almost over 15 years, I don't know the ins and outs of all of the code base of Octopus Deploy, as well as the engineers who work on Octopus Deploy day in and day out, or the product people who help design a lot of these types of solutions. So as you can see in this document, my proposed solution area is completely empty. And what we do now is we kind of work on this problem, and we'll bring this problem up to the product people, and we'll make sure that hey, have we properly defined that problem? And once we properly define the problem, then we can start shaping that solution. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about, what does it mean to shape a solution? And are UML diagrams and detailed design all needed for when we shape something here?
Does anyone use UML diagrams after they finish university? I'm not sure. No, definitely not. We came from a world where again, I'll harp on this point. We build a tool that we use ourselves, and this meant we got away with a few sins that perhaps another product wouldn't. We didn't do a lot of upfront design before, and even that's being generous to the amount that we did. We were never going to transition quickly to a world where we had a lot of upfront design. Nobody wanted this. So, Basecamp used this terminology, not too abstract, not too concrete, and I think that works really well for us. The proposed solution should be enough to convince everyone that there is a viable solution to the problem. We had to train ourselves a little bit with the idea that it's definitely not a spec. It doesn't specify the way it will look at the end of the engineering cycle. It's a place to start. It's enough to make sure we all have the same idea, to explore rabbit holes, but we focus on sort of wireframe and rough mock-ups at this point. So it's rough.
Now, when we're shaping out that pitch, and even though it's going to be rough, who are we including in that whole shaping process?
There's really no rules here. It really depends on the pitch. Octopus is a big product. It's got a lot of surface area, and a lot of people are experts in different parts of it. And I don't think anyone's an expert in the whole thing. So we often talk to the person who knows that area of the solution the best. We talk to engineering teams. We talk to your team to understand the customer scenarios. We talk to the designers. So, we talk to our marketing team to figure out how we're going to talk about this. But it's really a collaborative document, the pitch document.
And I think everyone can kind of wrap their heads around, what does a wireframe look like? Obviously, it's not the fully fleshed out UI diagram. Now, Mike, from an engineering perspective, what are the kinds of things are you seeing getting added into the proposed solution?
Things that really help the engineering teams where they're about to kick off on a build is, we talk about that, we're about to get onto this soon, but it's being a good bet. So a well-shaped pitch that's not too concrete, not too abstract. What makes it a good bet? And that's to set a team up to succeed, to get this build done. And so things that really help is if the exploration, we sometimes call it engineering recon, that you do, you kind of go, oh yeah, I think I can see how the solution goes. And then you jump into the code and pretend you're about to write it. And immediately you'll run into a roadblock and realize, okay, cool, I need to shift my mentality on the solution, or I need to say, look, don't go there, go this way. And so a way that I often think about it, engineering recon has a bit of a sort of a military sound to it. So if I think about stories I've heard, is that often when a spec ops team goes in to do something, they get upset when things go crazy and they say, oh, we've got bad intel. And that's sort of the same mentality there, is that we're trying to give people good intel, that they've got a sense of confidence that whatever we bet on, it's solvable. And there's a clarity around, look, there's something interesting over there, don't do it. Okay, that's going to get you off track. And there's some rabbit holes over here. Look, don't go too deep on them. Try to pave through them, because the value for this pitch can be delivered earlier if you guide the path right.
Now, I'm going to go back to that pitch for just a little bit. We're going to talk about the include, exclude process. We have this whole concept of include and exclude in multiple places specifically include in multiple places within Octopus Deploy. So if you look at accounts, if you look at variables, if you look at steps, there's all kinds of different places like that. When we're going through this proposed solution, are we going to be including those, or how do we kind of keep scope in check, so to speak?
Yeah, wow, this is a good example, isn't it? Software projects have their own gravity, I feel like, and they tend to just pull everything into them. And before we moved to Shape Up, I think we probably would have kept going on this piece of work until we bottomed out on it, because there's this tendency to want to fix everything associated with the problem, make it all perfect. You feel like you haven't done your job if you don't, you've left things unfinished. And in Shape Up, Basecamp dedicated a whole chapter to deciding when to stop. And I think, as we talked about earlier, this was something we really struggled with. And it's also where that time box is really powerful, because it's such a forcing function. We know we've got 6 weeks to build this, And this is why it's really important, I think, to define the problem that we're trying to solve as well, because between the time box and knowing the problem that we want to solve, it lets us focus on that. If we end up solving other problems as a bonus, that's great. We always try, obviously, not to leave the code base or the product in an inconsistent state. But at the end of the day, the prime goal is to ship something that moves the product forward, that adds value to our customers. And that's what we'd focus on.
I think that's kind of a key point we really didn't bring up earlier is we're shaping this pitch, but the whole point of this is to have this work be worked on for 6 weeks. And then you almost put it down. You say, okay, we're done after these 6 weeks, as opposed to, say, a 2-week sprint where it's just this constant this overkill, so to speak, where you're just always constantly running. It's these 6 weeks time boxes. So it feels like a big part of this whole pitch design work is truly hammering out that scope. And I know that that was one of Mike's favorite phrases is that scope hammer.
Yeah, it's a huge part. It is a really nice metaphor as well. And it doesn't finish with the end of the shaping process either. It continues right through the build cycle. Mike's military analogy earlier is pretty nice because, no plan survives contact with the enemy, or whatever the saying is. And it's true of pitch documents as well. A development cycle never goes exactly according to plan. And you continue that scope hammering process right throughout the 6-week builds. At every decision point, you have to make that decision. Do we include this? Do we exclude it? If we're getting short on time towards the end, what can we hammer this down to the bare minimum to add value, to change the status quo?
Now, one of the things as we look at this particular pitch is this doesn't feel like it's a massive feature such as config as code or workers or spaces or anything like that. We wouldn't really expect this to take the full 6 weeks, or how do we kind of batch this work up into so it can fit into those 6 weeks? Do we have the entire team work for 2 weeks on it? Do we have one person or two people work for it on 6 weeks? Like, what were some of the lessons we learned with that?
Yeah, so again, Basecamp called out this concept in Shape Up of small batch and big batch, and we adopted the terminology as well. So the idea is that the big batch takes the full 6 weeks for whatever the size of the engineering team is, and the small batch might be a 2-week or a 3-week piece of work. And honestly, we found a little friction with that. This is just us, I think, getting used to the process as well. We struggled with those smaller pieces of work. The definite feedback from the teams has been that they can feel quite frantic doing multiple pieces of those multiple smaller pieces in a cycle. And I think also what we've learned and are still continuing to learn is that the way we shape even has to be a little different as well. If you're looking to do a 2-week piece of work, that it has to be shaped more firmly, I guess is the word, than something bigger. There's no room for exploration or any rabbit holes in a 2-week piece of work. You have to hit the ground running from day one, whereas you've got a little more wiggle room on those bigger pieces. And even you said just then, Bob, that it didn't seem like a 6-week piece of work. Honestly, not sure. Cutting the work up to fit in those time slots is something that takes practice as well, and we're definitely still getting better at.
And you mentioned those 2-week sprints. The 2-week pitches that we'd sometimes work on. And I know at one point we tried it where we would have one team that would work on 3 2-week projects. And I know the engineers, they had some really interesting feedback around that, specifically like context switching.
Yeah, the context switching, I think also just the sense, like Michael was saying before, you feel like nothing can go wrong. You're always on the clock. And so by the end of that, it did feel like the team didn't. One of the things that's called out in the book is just working with a sense of calm and order the whole way through. And so our teams were saying, hey, wait a minute, this seems to be a bit of a key principle that we're breaking here in doing that. And so it's something we're still learning and working on. And so the feedback from our teams was, look, we'd rather try and fit things into maybe a smaller team, 2 people for 6 weeks, which leaves a lot of wiggle room there for exploration, but you don't have as many people walk in it. So you could probably get 2 pitches that are 2 people for 2 weeks, for 6, 2 for 6, done in the same time, but the team would feel less frantic about it and less context switching, and they can flow.
Now, this pitch that we've been talking about with this whole exclude, include permissions, and everything like that, this is to add a new feature into the product that is the customer will end up using. But we also have engineering only pitches. Could you give a little bit of some examples on what those are and why we picked those up?
Yeah, so when you're working on a product like Octopus, we incurred tech debt to get to market. That's probably the easiest way to say it. And at some point, you got to pay some of that down. Otherwise, you just end up going slower and slower. And it becomes this really vicious cycle, a downward spiral that you've got to break. And so what we've landed on is that we have a budget that we set aside for doing these kind of work. So it could be a renovation, a refactor, a conversion of some type. And I think the number at the moment was in 2020 was around about 30%. 30% of our planned work was invested in this. And depending on how much tech debt or how much we've underinvested over time, we will dial that number up. So coming into 2021, we're looking at dialing that number up a bit. And then, we'll dial it back down. I've heard different companies where they've just got a baseline. 20% is our minimum for us to stay long time sustainably healthy. And those pitches, like I said, they could be almost anything. And so a concrete example for us is we were using the Nancy framework for our web framework, and that served us really well, but it's gone end of life. And so now we're tied to it and its bugs. And what if we want to move forward the runtime that we're on and that's not supported? So we have a choice to either own the future of Nancy, which is something that we don't want to do, or we've got to convert. And so conversion is on the horizon for us.
Okay, so let's pretend for a second that we have shaped this pitch, this exclude permissions pitch. The next step is the betting table. Michael, could you walk us through what is the betting table?
Sure. I've got to admit, when I first read Shape Up, the betting table came across as a little bit of an arcane ritual. If I'm honest, I probably rolled my eyes a little bit. It kind of reminded me of the whole planning poker thing from Scrum or whatever. But honestly, the concept is much more simple and much more powerful than that. The betting table is just the moment when you commit on the work that you're going to do for that cycle. And again, working on those cadences, it's a really powerful forcing function. This is the last possible moment that you can make this decision. And I think what that explicit betting table brings is it avoids the problem of, there's nothing less empowering as a product manager to not understand why we're working on something or to not feel like what we are working on is the most valuable thing. That's a terrible feeling. And on the other side, as an engineer, as a member of a development team, what a terrible feeling to feel like you're working on something and the company doesn't have your back. You feel like everyone's kind of, are we still working on this? Why did we even start working on this? The betting table removes this. It's as a company, we say we are committing to this for this cycle. And yeah, everything else is pretty much noise. That's the key takeaway.
One of the things I noticed with the betting table, and we've talked about circuit breakers a little bit, is we are betting on the pitches for the betting on the work that we want to do in the upcoming cycle. And we could have that situation where we might be working on a long running project and we might stop it for a little while. How often does that happen? And are we happy with continuing to do that?
We definitely have things that take longer than one cycle. Actually, the betting analogy is nice. Like everything else from Shape Up, the words are really powerful because you are placing a bet. The outcome isn't guaranteed. It's all about minimizing the risks, but at the same time saying we place this bet knowing the risks and accepting them. And we definitely do pieces of work that we don't finish in one cycle. Usually, actually, I think every time so far, we've been conscious of that going in at the start. We've placed that bet saying, we bet on this cycle of work with the full expectation that we will still be working on this after this cycle. And I think that's perfectly fine. I think we'll talk about some of the specific frictions a little bit later. But yeah, I think it's fine to place a bet and know that work will continue beyond the cycle. And we've still got those checkpoints to check in between each cycle and make sure we're still happy working on that.
Who participates in that betting table? Because myself, I'm not part of it just because of time zones and everything like that. But I know a lot of people, and some might even surprise you.
Today, it's pretty much the product managers, the engineering managers, and our CEO, Paul Stavel. And that is the set of people that we need to be able to make that final decision on that cycle. I think it's important that we can make that at the time. Everyone's in the room. We need to specify the what, the who, and the how. What we've found is that going into those betting tables, we usually have a pretty strong idea already we definitely have a very strong idea already of the things that we want to do. As you would expect, we've spent time shaping those pitches. We've already built up an amount of consensus around them by the time they come to the table. So in our experience, at least, the betting tables become quite a lot about logistics, to be honest. Just how do we get this work done? Which teams are the best place to do it? And we actually, another thing that we've landed on is we tend to split the betting table over 2 meetings. And the reason we started doing that was just that we had a few scenarios where we felt like we couldn't bet on something just because we were missing a key piece of information, or there was a question that we needed answered that we couldn't get answered right at the time. And it seemed wrong to postpone that for the whole cycle. So we kind of do a dry run of it, figure out any questions that we need answered, and then do the final one. Maybe that's just us learning, and we'll drop that as time goes by. We'll see.
Now, what would be some reasons why we wouldn't pick up a pitch during that betting table?
Yeah, we've definitely seen there's 2 main reasons that we don't do pieces of work, and they're very rarely, never, that it's not a good idea. There's at any given time no shortage of valuable things that we could build. The 2 main reasons that we don't end up betting on something is, number one, there was just something else on the table that was more valuable to us at the time. It was more timely, simple as that. The second one is we felt it was valuable, but for whatever reason, we didn't feel like we could bet on it for that cycle. And that might be that we felt there were some rabbit holes that we still weren't confident in making that bet, that we didn't have the right teams available because they were already working on something else. So it's in those cases, it was not about saying no, it's just about hitting snooze on it. And we've seen over and over again that these pitches that we hit snooze on, they come back up, and usually they come back stronger than when we hit snooze on them the first time.
Because creating a pitch, it's a non-trivial task. I mean, based on what we've talked about, it's you have to define the problem, and you have to collaborate with engineers, design, product, and everything like that. I mean, there is a time investment on that. So you almost have those circuit breakers built in as well, saying, is this a good idea or not a good idea? Now
Checks and balances. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it helps out. I mean, very rarely does a poorly shaped pitch make it to the betting table. Oftentimes it's like, okay, we have to make sure it is properly shaped so we can answer these questions. Now let's assume for a minute that the pitch that we've been talking about, this exclude permissions pitch, it was picked up in that first cycle of 2021. Now the engineers, they have this pitch, they're ready to get their hands dirty on some code. What happens? What does this look like during this build process?
Yeah, so the team will pick that up. They usually, sometimes they don't know what's coming up, and that's a bit of a surprise. But either way, the teams are really great, and they just say, "Cool, new adventure, let's go." Other times, the team might have been working on something for a while, so we'll bring that work back to them. And so the very first, it just sounds like typical software development. A lot of this, right? There's nothing new here. It's just some new words, new combinations, a few tweaks. And so the team kicks off, and they think about their neighborhood and who should they talk to, and get involved in the project and come up with their charter of how they're going to work together. When are we going to have our daily syncs? And sometimes that's really, really fast, and sometimes it's a brand new team for some reason, and so they'll figure that out. But really importantly, there is that time ticks by and you want to get working on things. And like we said before, the scope hammer comes out and the team will say, look, we're 3 weeks in. We need to be really careful here about what we actually keep on working on. And so they'll rip out the scope hammer and use it. And then as they're nearing sort of the end of the cycle, so end of week 6, usually trying to tie a bow in things. Now, and that's where the circuit breaker gets invoked, about that whole chapter on when do you stop, and there's some details on that you can read more about. Early on, when we first started doing this, our teams weren't in the habit. And so you have this, I know I'm the same. I just want to get that little bit more done. I could be so much more proud of this feature if I just did a little bit more. But what it meant was that our teams were overrunning that time box. And then that bled into the 2-week cooldown or sharpening period. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then that kind of overran. The snake ate its own tail if we weren't really careful. And so our teams got much smarter about ship early, ship often, all these good habits, get the highest value things done first, get feedback on them first, use a walking skeleton approach. Just all these good habits come out of the time box. And then we're noticing teams now starting to wrap up early, and even having a couple of days free at the end of the time and a whole sense of calm and order on the way through.
Now, but a big part of this is getting time to focus on those features, because we talked about with the area teams, you would have maybe 4 people working on in that particular area. One person would be on vacation and one person is sick, and you have 2 people just fixing bugs. You really need to have time to focus on this stuff. How do we handle that unplanned work that comes up?
It almost sounds like we're always on vacation and we're always sick. Yeah, that's the thing. So back when we had those area teams, there was a lot of interruption, and so that was something that we were really trying to figure out. How do you deal with that? And so over the years, we started with all hands support, and you do a day a week. But that day you get a bunch of support tickets and then you'd reply, but because of time zones, the replies wouldn't come back to the next day. And you'd have this knock-on effect of interruptions for the next week or so. So we said, let's do a week. So we did a week. And then you have an interruption or so for the week following. And that worked really well. But we've iterated and iterated on how do we deal with unplanned work. And so a really great way to deal with unplanned work is don't have any. So don't ship bugs, right? And that's a real effort that we're going through, is just increase quality, increase flow, increase quality, lower risk releases, those kind of things. Canary programs and flighting to cloud first before we go to self-hosted customers. So that's one way to deal with it. But another thing we've said is, I think you talked about before, we mentioned that Octopus is one product. So we've got one big team at the moment that works on Octopus. There's about 21 software engineers that work on it. We split those up into 3 sub-teams, and we've got this concept called QRF, which is just a group of people who are held in reserve to deal with unplanned work and to reduce the impact of unplanned work on the other 2 teams. And then those other 2 teams can really focus on this planned work. So when we're going to the betting table, we're thinking, well, look, that team, they're in QRF, they're reserved. These 2 teams, yep, they're ready to go. That's the people on those teams, away we go. We're iterating on this design for 2021, but it's probably better we just think about where we're at now. And so QRF is our way of dealing with those unplanned work and reducing the impact of unplanned work on the people who are focusing.
And we could have an entire webinar just on discussing what is QRF, how do we handle QRF, because it has its own life cycle and prioritization and all that other fun stuff.
Yeah.
So I want to move on just a little bit. After the work is finished, that 6-week build process, that 6-week cycle is done, we have what's known as a kind of a cool down period, but we changed the verbiage a little bit to sharpening. What does that mean? Like, why do we even have something like this?
Yeah. So again, this is a suggestion from the Basecamp team. Other companies have done 20 or 30, 25% time. We had a similar shape, but once we moved to these really hard, like these cycles with this rhythm to it, we thought about, well, what does that actually mean? And so one of the things that I was saying before I don't enjoy about the Scrum terminology is that sprint and the way that played out. And so cool down felt almost right, but we found our team saying, that's my chance to cool down after I've sprinted for 6 weeks. And we just thought, let's nip that in the bud, because the intent is to work with a sense of calm and order and sustainability all the time. And so we were really leaning on the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And one of the chapters in there talks about sharpening the axe or sharpening the saw. And the intent is that when you go to do work, if your tools are blunt, it's much harder. lot more effort. And so what we say to teams or to individuals is that, look, go focus for these 6 weeks, go do the work that we've sort of, I guess, dispatched to you. And then as you come across speed bumps or roadblocks or just things that light up and you say, gee, I'd love to do that, I got passionate about it. Look, can you focus on the work we've dispatched? Because that's important and timely. And then in that 2 weeks that comes after, that's self-directed time. Go do that thing. It could be learn a thing. It could be fix a thing, renovate a thing, build a little thing. But just remembering it is only 2 weeks there. And so we've even got people that will team up and or teams of people that will team up and get a thing done and really swarm on it. We've got other people that will say, look, I'm going to actually invest 3 sharpening periods in this effort. And so they might have some code that's sort of sitting there as shelfware for a while, but it's simmering and boiling over time.
One of my favorite features that came out of that sharpening period was in our script editor inside of Octopus was the ability to have kind of this almost IntelliSense that was added in there. Like you hit, I think it's Control Space, and you can start typing in the variables. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. And it was just someone said, I really want to solve this problem, and I think I have a really interesting way to do it. And I'm not going to put together a pitch. I'm just going to do it. It turned out to be great.
Yeah, it's nice. Hey.
Just this week, we had a global search feature as well that came out of sharpening period. Am I revealing here? Yeah.
Global launch right here on the webinar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When I saw that, I was like, I can't wait to see that get added into the product, because it still has to go through the normal QA process, has to go through, the vetting process. We can't just like willy-nilly throw something out there. But yeah, it's really cool to see the different things.
We should do another entire webinar on how we do QA at Octopus, because we don't do QA at Octopus, right? Yeah, that's a really important thing just to call out there.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on, and for like the last 10 or so minutes, let's talk about what has been working for us and what doesn't work, or what do we want to improve. Now that we've been using this for almost over a year, because we started in the fall of about 2019, and I think November was when we first really kind of kicked it off. Now that we've been using it for a year, what's really worked well for us?
Well, for me, certainly the most powerful thing to come out of the Shape Up process is the time box. If we had to throw everything else away, you'd have to pry that out of my cold dead hands, because I think it transformed the way we work, and it solved so many problems that we were seeing. It puts everyone onto the same cadence, and just that forcing function of having to shape work to fit into the time box is really powerful. Mike?
I second that. The time box, I said before, forces so many good habits. And that rhythm, I actually really appreciate the word rhythm in this as well, in that our entire company pretty much adopted the same rhythm. And so we sort of started in engineering, but the advisory team use it, and other teams know how to interact with it. So Michael mentioned before about marketing. Well, previously, they had no idea when things were happening, and our teams would often just forget that the focus is on get the feature to market. Oh, market, hang on. So nowadays, there's this real clarity and predictability to what we do. So it makes that whole company interaction much easier. The time box, and I'll throw in there around the betting. The betting table is that final decision point, which Michael was explaining before. It solves those problems of the disempowered product manager, or even the disempowered CEO or VP of engineering. There was this sense of, I really feel it's important for you to work on this other thing, but I feel really bad telling you to stop.
And actually, the betting table kind of comes out of that cadence as well, doesn't it? Because everyone really finishes and starts at the same time, it gives you that really neat point to be able to look at everything on the table together. And it means, because the cost of building a feature to us, the biggest cost of building a feature is the opportunity cost of the things that we don't build. And having everything sitting on the table makes that very explicit what you're not choosing.
Yeah. And that's something I noticed over the years. There has been this underlying sentiment at Octopus that we just can't do enough, right? And we feel guilty about all the good things we can see that we just should do.
Like that pitch Bob had earlier, right? How have we not done that?
How have we not done it, amongst the other 100 things that we should have done by now? And I think what this has caused us to do, what this has caused us to do is be really honest about our capacity, be really honest about the work we're choosing, and be real honest about the work we're not choosing, and have to consider that it has to be okay. But the really nice thing is also, as we add capacity, well, we add throughput, and we can do more of those things, and we're just still being honest about how much work we can get done.
Another thing I like about Shape Up is just overall, I feel like it's very pragmatic. It's not, it's not very prescriptive. The way it calls out the amount of design, I think, suits us quite nicely as well. Yeah, that all fit pretty well.
I'm a massive fan of that predictability and that cadence, because from an advisory point of view, we need to know about the latest and greatest features and get a chance to kind of get our hands dirty with the code, or get our hands dirty with some new feature that's coming out. And we kind of have an understanding now, like, okay, right around maybe week 4 or week 5 of the cycle, we can start downloading early access previews off of our internal build server and installing it on a local VM and getting a chance to play around with it, seeing what how does this work. I think a perfect example is config as code, because I had a ton of questions, and I knew the only way that I can answer that was just starting to use the product, and I was really happy with something like that. But now we've sung the praises of Basecamp for Shape Up for the last hour or so. What do we want to improve internally with it?
Yeah, it's worth calling out that not everything's a trade-off, right? And not everything's rainbows and lollipops with our move to Shape Up. It's also worth calling out that any friction we feel is no way a criticism on Shape Up. It's just us either misinterpreting it or not being a perfect fit. So yeah, I think we alluded to it earlier, but the time box, as powerful as it is, it is also a double-edged sword, right? So what we found is that 6 weeks, certain pieces of work slot into that like a glove very naturally. Lots of other pieces don't. It's a little bit like the Goldilocks thing. If it's just right, it's great. If it's too hot or too cold, in this case, too big or too small, we found it doesn't fit as naturally. For those bigger pieces, the ones that we're very aware at the start are going to take multiple cycles, sometimes we found the Shape Up process feels just like a bit of an accounting trick, and it would have just been more realistic just to be honest with ourselves and say we're going to work on this for the next 4 months. But again, that might just be something that we need to get better at. And on the other end of the spectrum, those smaller pieces, yeah, I think we spoke about this earlier as well, but they can feel very rushed when you try and put multiple of those into a 6-week cycle. And there's also obviously beyond a certain threshold, the whole process just feels not worth it for the piece of work. So we need a few extra gears there, I think, as well.
Yeah, something we didn't really call out right at the beginning, but it's worth thinking about, is we picked up Shape Up because the Basecamp team were a similar size to us as well, and trying to solve, I think we said really clearly, solving similar problems. So that's what really resonated. If this is not going to work for every situation, and even as Octopus is growing next year, there are teams that we're spinning up at Octopus, and even QRF Works doesn't work using Shape Up. It's nothing to do with it. They've got a Kanban board and a triage process and things like that they use. So there'll be other teams at Octopus that do not use Shape Up because it's just not the right match for it. And that's no indictment on Shape Up in itself. I think any process, like Michael said, is a trade-off. A really interesting video I watched recently, I just to give a call out, by Kent Beck of Extreme Programming and TDD fame. He had a learning experience when he was at Facebook, and after leaving Facebook, and he's come up with this sort of terminology around 3X programming, which is around exploration, expansion, and extraction. And what I found really interesting about that is that in each of those different phases or parts of a company, it's really important to think about the process you do use or you don't use. So when you're trying to do a lot of experimentation, a bit of a heavier weight process like shaping, that doesn't fly. You're more interested in doing number of experiments per day or per week. And having an 8-week cadence, again, just doesn't fly. It's not manageable for that kind of work. But right where Octopus Server is at right now, it's pretty much in that Goldilocks zone for us.
Although we are already aware that we're going to outgrow that single betting table, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we've got we've already got 2 betting tables running, one for our commercial platform, one for Octopus Server.
Right.
Next year, there'll probably be about 5 different betting tables running, which is a good way of sort of, again, embracing the reality that we want these teams to be autonomous, but we also want them to have a level of coordination control. And so the alignment of those cadences is, again, going to play into our favor.
Actually, right now we have 3 betting tables because the advisory team, we have adopted Shape Up as well. And so we have a betting
By the
table.
way, we got 4. The office team did it as well for this.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, exactly. It is a bit like a virus in a way that good ideas do catch, right? And then each of our teams is really thinking logically about, does it fit us? Does it help us or not?
One of the things that I really liked about it was, from the advisory point of view, is, again, we had all these great ideas and we were really good about starting things, but we never really good about finishing things. And one of the phrases, I can't remember who introduced it, but it kind of felt like we were trying to boil the ocean. And by having this whole process in place, we can really focus on, like, okay, let's get this one thing done and let's do it really, really well. And then we can put it away. So if you want to see from, like, what are some of the things advisory did, if you even just take a look at our docs, the database deployment stuff, that was an example of something that we've really been priding ourselves on. Like, yes, we're adding more and more content into there because we focused on it. I know that Mark, for example, and a few other folks, they really worked on adding in REST API examples to make that that section really, really helpful. So I really liked it in the way that it has helped our team focus as well.
Nice.
So we've kind of wrapped up our conversation. Derek, are there any questions for us?
Hey guys, thank you very much. That was really great. I've got a few questions. Got a question from David. Do you allow engineers to work on anything during sharpening? And is it similar to the Google approach where the engineering team have that 1 day a week? Is that how that works?
Pretty much exactly that. I was saying before, this is self-directed time. And so we do nudge people and say, look, it is good if you can think about using that time for a sharpening aspect. But like we said before, some of our favorite little features have come out of that sharpening time. Yeah, so it is very much self-directed.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mike. What does an engineering pitch review look like and who reviews it? Is it peer reviewed or does it need to go through an engineering manager? How does that work?
I think we were saying before that shaping is collaborative. You can do shaping on your own, but those pitches often come back, right, for another cycle because you've got blind spots. So we talk about collaborative. For the engineering only ones, I guess the product managers, you often don't get involved in those. Hey, so from that point of view, it's sort of an engineering review board. Gee, that sounds too fancy. It's just collaborating within the engineering team. And so again, subject matter experts, people who've worked on those areas before. It would be, senior engineers or principal engineers would get involved in that.
I think what we do is we drop it in, if I recall correctly, in a lot of cases, we drop it into a Slack channel and just to see if we can start building momentum. And it's almost like, to me, it's almost like a litmus test. If we can drop it into a Slack channel and it doesn't immediately get ripped to shreds. So like, okay, this feels like it's a pretty reasonable idea that a pretty reasonable problem we need to solve.
Yeah, building critical mass, building momentum, they all really matter.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. What happens to a pitch which isn't bet on? Do you keep these in a backlog of sorts for the future or do they just slowly die off?
No, we don't have a central backlog. We're pretty explicit. At the end of every cycle, we Marie Kondo everything off and we start fresh every cycle. We encourage people, if they care about that pitch, they can maintain their own Trello board or track these things however they choose. But it's really refreshing to be able to begin each cycle with just the things that are on the board to choose between. No psychic weight of the other 1,000 things sitting there that you haven't done over the past years. So it was a conscious decision by us not to have that centralized backlog. It's up to people to resubmit those pitches if they feel they are still timely in the next cycle.
The advisory team, for example, we have our own Trello board that we kind of keep track of, like, what are the most important things that we think that should be added into the product, and we prioritize ourselves. And so when the betting table comes up, we will probably say these 1 or 2 things we think are the most important things for us to pick up. And Michael's really honest with us. He goes, I don't think this particular pitch is going to be picked up because of these reasons. We're still in the middle of doing X. We need to do Y. And at first, perfectly understand. And we really appreciate that honesty because it helps us plan and prioritize as well. Like, okay, we don't think that will be picked up, but maybe these other 2 items will be picked up instead.
Excellent. Well, that's the end of the webinar's questions. So unfortunately, it's time to wrap up, chaps. Okay, so just want to say thank you very much for everyone for attending. I learned a bunch of stuff as well. This is for everyone, but also for Hull. A recording of the email of the webinar will be emailed to you in the next 48 hours. Chances are you'll probably get it in your inbox early Friday morning. We do have a webinar feedback form that will pop up at the end of today's session. There's no details that you don't need to provide any personal details. It would really help it would help us with our webinars going forward into 2021 if you could take just a moment to fill that out. We are back in 2021 with Phil Stevenson on January 13th. He's going to be doing an Octopus 101 webinar. And then we're back on January 27th. What we're actually going to be doing there is giving a demo of a Terraform provider that we're currently working on. That'll be with John Bristow and Michael Levan, and we're actually going to be shipping our Terraform provider live to HashiCorp as part of the webinar. So that'll be super exciting. So unfortunately, that is us at the end of today's session. I just want to say thank you very much to the guests, Bob Walker, Michael Richardson, and Mr. Michael Noonan, and particularly the Australians. Obviously, it is almost 1 a.m. there, so thank you very much. Super impressed. And guys, thank you very much for coming along.
It was a fun chat. Thank you.
Really fun. Thank you.
Merry Christmas.